for the entire span of recorded history, the assumption had always been that biology is destiny. It's all predetermined, and there's nothing you could do about it. We crystallized the new idea of the 18th century, which was people could make their own destinies.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. On the other hand, you've got a lot of people who are left out. At the start of the Republic, you have this very unequal founding reality. People of color effectively weren't even humans. If you don't own property, your rights are in the garbage can. Women didn't have the right to vote in America. It was horrible. What it means to be an American is to be a part of this project of trying to get that ugly, unequal reality closer and closer to the beauty of the dream. Our internal quest to live up to this promise changed the whole world. It changed the entire view of humanity of itself. And yet you have these people who didn't get the memo. They just seem to have missed the whole point of the country. And they actually think that the founding reality of profound inequality, is fine with them. And that view even tries to masquerade as science.
I'm merely drawing attention to the fact that you believe that poor people are genetically different.
Yes.
For a century or more, scholars have known that the differences among people in intelligence is largely inherited.
When you extract the general factor of intelligence, males, on average, score 3.6, 4 IQ points higher than women.
Even Rushton admits that's tiny, but says it explains why you see fewer women in top jobs.
You see where this takes us in some very, very dangerous directions. Biologically determined politics.
Cisgenic immigration, Hispanics in particular, but also of other peoples with low IQs, will clearly have an effect of reducing the intelligence of the host populations that have to absorb these people.
We're back to blood as a determination of character. We've learned nothing from the Holocaust, nothing from Darfur, nothing from the emergent capacity of evil that people do to each other on the grounds of someone being different from them by birth. So that person is not only talking biological nonsense, he's talking dangerous biological nonsense.
There's a strong belief that the differences in society, those who are poor, those who are rich, those who are smart, everything is in the genes. That it's the internal that determines everything, not the external. The external is something to do with politics or society, but biology is internal. And so every view of the gene is, it is the determiner because it's inside.
I think it's important to explode the gene myth, a false belief that makes us think that genes can do anything and everything and are responsible for anything and everything that we do and that happens in our lives.
A new study claims that a genetic variant is responsible for cheating and promiscuous behavior.
Are you a liberal or a conservative? Either way, you may have been born predisposed to leaning one way or the other.
According to your genes, you guys are actually extremely sexually compatible.
Is there something in their DNA?
We tested each of you for the warrior gene.
That causes them to rage?
And the results are in.
Do we believe in the gene thing? I mean, I do.
Winning is somewhat maybe innate. You know, you have the winning gene.
The horror movie
gene?
The God gene.
Could there be a terrorist gene?
There is no evidence for any genes for these things, but it is a kind of unfounded belief. And molecular biology has become a religion in the sense that people accept it without questioning it. And the people who are doing it at the highest level are its prophets. And when they tell you something, you should believe what the prophets or the disciples tell you.
Ever since he helped to discover the structure of DNA in 1953, biologist James Watson has been the leading evangelist for the belief in the power of genes.
Genes, because they are the script for life, have power. We'd like to think we could be anything we wanted. But I think we can't.
In Watson's view, inequality is unavoidable and written into our DNA, so it's naive to imagine that we can achieve a truly equal society.
It's just evolution happening. This evolution depends on random changes in genetic messages, which make some organisms better able to survive and others not that able. Once you start thinking in terms of evolution, you're not surprised by seeing a lot of inequality. You know, that all men are created equal, we know is a political statement, not a scientific statement.
Biologist Edward O. Wilson shares Watson's view. He's well known for his vigorous defense of biodiversity, but he's also a leading advocate of the theory that we are essentially imprisoned by Paleolithic genes encoded in our DNA 100,000 years ago, when modern humans evolved from more primitive species.
If I can simplify and tell me if I'm wrong, behavior comes from genes.
Ultimately from genes, yeah.
Wilson believes there are biological barriers that prevent us from having free will, because we're unconsciously directed by genes that predispose us to aggression, tribalism, male dominance, and other behaviors.
We have what I like to call the genetic leash on culture that is absolutely unique to the human species. There's a different length and kind of genetic leash for every category or subcategory of behavior.
Looking through the lens of biology, Wilson described how humans got their human nature. Male humans were originally hunters. They evolved to be aggressive and are still innately violent. Males are driven to multiply their genes and are not, by nature, monogamous. They have evolved to think analytically and are more likely than females to end up with jobs in business, politics, or science. Female humans are genetically programmed to have maternal feelings. They have evolved strategies to catch and to keep males. They are by nature coy and faithful homemakers. Although females have superior verbal abilities, their brains are less equipped to think analytically, allowing them to perform repetitive domestic tasks. For Wilson, our evolutionary past was still with us, living on in specific patterns of behavior controlled by our genes.
E.O. Wilson writes that even with identical education and equal access to all professions, men are likely to continue to play a disproportionate role in political life, business, and science.
That's a very important justifying ideology. If you believe that all these characteristics, first of all, are universal, and secondly, that they're in the genes, then you would be forced to say we must have society as it is now. So it destroys any question of political morality to change things, and it also destroys any claim that we could change things. So it has tremendous importance.
Biological determinism didn't begin with genetics. Rulers throughout history claimed their divine right to wield power over others was hereditary, based in their noble blood. Even though the United States was the first modern republic to reject aristocracy based on biology, soon after the nation's founding, craniometry was being used to defend the enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans. Prominent scientists dug up skulls from native burial grounds and slave cemeteries, measured them, and falsely claimed that these groups had smaller skulls on average than Caucasians, were inferior in intelligence, and even a lower species. The same pseudoscience was used to oppose women's demands for equal education and their right to vote. Doctors and anatomists told women that their brains were smaller than men's, making them less intelligent, and warned them that the strain of higher learning would lead to infertility. It took decades to discredit these false claims.
Every century, every decade, every year, you've got to contest this thing. It just turns out that you think, oh, well, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we've resolved this question. Oh, well, no, after women's suffrage, you've resolved the question. Well, after the Civil Rights Movement, no, you're going to have this tug of war. But it's a fight that has to be had.
American exceptionalism, I think, conceals to women the fact, because we're always being told how lucky we are, that we are way, way down the list in political representation, in childcare, health care, equal pay. By almost any measure, we're way down the list.
When it comes to the most powerful positions in society, women continue to be a small minority, far behind many countries that the U.S. often criticizes for their treatment of women. Women remain unequal in value at the workplace, facing discrimination, lower wages, and less opportunity for advancement.
Harvard President Larry Summers floated the idea that when it comes to math and science, there may be an innate difference between men and women.
Larry Summers ignited a controversy in 2005 when he gave a talk as university president and suggested that biology was the primary reason for a lack of women in powerful positions in society.
So what he said was, I'm going to tell you why there aren't any women at the top of anything. It's not just the academic world. It's law, it's medicine, it's business. They're not at the top of anything.
As a faculty member at Harvard, Nancy Hopkins walked out of Summers' talk. Years before, she'd helped to expose how bias against women stalled their advancement at MIT, which prompted MIT to make things more equal. So she was angry to hear the president of Harvard giving credence to a biological explanation.
These attitudes really have consequences in the workplace, and they hold people back. And as a leader of students, you want to encourage people to achieve at the highest level, not make them believe that they could never reach the highest level because their aptitude is not sufficient.
I think, the Larry Summers statement was probably correct, and his big mistake was apologizing.
Oh, no, not at all.
Oh, no, okay.
Claims that biological differences are at the root of inequality between men and women continue to make headlines. But anthropologist Agustin Fuentes and others have shown that such claims are based on unsound science.
The problem is people often confuse gender with what we call sex, right? So sex is a biological term. Gender is this very complex historical, political, social reality. The question is, how do we understand unequal gender access? How do we understand the histories of voting rights, of abilities to appear in public or not, of abilities to own land, of whether or not you're called property or not? That's not biology. That's not in your DNA. That's in our social, political, and economic histories. But it's taking advantage of biology. That is, I can identify you as a female and you as a male, and we're going to work with that. So biology can be co-opted, but it does not explain gender difference, gender inequality, and it doesn't help us understand the future of gender relations.
The belief that genes and evolution determine where we end up in society reaches beyond gender. In today's economic system, most people in the United States will fall below the poverty line at some point in their life, often because they become unemployed, lose a spouse, or develop a serious illness. Congress continues to cut the safety net, while the 3 richest Americans own more wealth than the poorest half of the country, 150 million people. As economic inequality reaches record proportions, the ostentatious lifestyles of the economic elite has led historians to call this the Second Gilded Age.
There are 2 completely different, competing ways of looking at the world in America today. One is the American dream. The idea that it's within your power to be anyone you want is the American dream, is completely contradicted by the social Darwinist idea that you're either born one way or you're not. And that basically if you're born into the upper classes, you've got the right genes. If you're born into the lower classes, you're part of the genetic sludge that has gone to the bottom of the gene pool. And you've got the media cranking out these completely bogus stories that actually significant slices of the population have the poverty gene.
Many hope to erase the divide between the haves and the have-nots. But what if nature demands winners and losers in life? Could poverty be genetic?
If you believe that inequality, that someone's ability to do well as a captain of industry and someone doing poorly and living a life on a substandard factory line, if you believe that that's written in the DNA in some way or another, then you have no responsibility and things can stay the way they are. And that's really dangerous.
Are you saying that the underclass could be genetically determined?
Genetically determined is way too strong a term.
Well, you see, you say that poverty is genetically determined. It will become evident that the population below the poverty line in the US has a configuration of the relevant genetic makeup significantly different from the configuration of the population above the poverty line. This is not unimaginable. It is almost certainly true.
Charles Murray came up with data that purported to show a relationship between IQ and poverty. The IQ itself became a kind of symbol for native, intrinsic, inherent intelligence. Your genetic predisposition, your genetic endowment. And there was something fatalistic and deterministic about it.
Unless you have the kinds of skills that enable you to score pretty well on an IQ test, you are not going to be a first-rate lawyer. You are not going to be a first-rate physician. You aren't going to be a first-rate professor. You aren't going to be a first-rate lot of things in this society.
Critics like psychologist Jay Joseph have studied claims about IQ for many years. He's convinced that there are fundamental problems with IQ tests that completely undermine Murray's conclusions.
Test creators can create any kind of test distribution they desire. They could create a test that show the races are equal. They could create a test that show that women are more intelligent than men. They could create a test that show that the working class is more intelligent than professional class. But they choose questions that get the results. It doesn't matter necessarily how obviously biased a question is, which many of them are very biased. They're designed to reflect the existing inequalities in society and in many cases to justify those inequalities.
Most controversial was Murray's claim that Black people and Latinos are less intelligent on average than whites, and that this explained unequal social outcomes.
I thought we had killed this kind of stuff off, and yet here it comes back out of the grave, dressed up in scientific garb. But the last time we saw it, it was wearing a Klan's robe, and it's the same set of ideas.
So I don't accept any of this data that they're presenting, because
Alvin Puissant, a professor of psychology at Harvard, challenged Murray in debates at universities around the country.
scientifically, they wanted to compare so-called genetic differences between blacks and whites. then they would have to take a group of white people that had similar experiences to black Americans here in America. That is, they would have to find a group of white people that experienced 250 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, constant ongoing discrimination, and let's compare their IQs and see how they come out on these tests.
If you tell people over and over and over again that they are inferior, that some of them will come to believe that and then behave accordingly. A lot of the time that I spend and things that I do is trying to get black students, parents, children to overcome these feelings of inferiority that have to stem from the society. It's not innate, right? It's not innate or genetic that you feel inside that you are inferior. It's because messages that are being sent to you from society in all kinds of overt and subtle ways.
More than 20 years after the bell curve, pseudo-scientific claims about IQ and race continue to generate controversy.
The London Science Museum has canceled a lecture by a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist because of remarks he made about race and intellect.
Dr. James Watson is quoted as saying he is inherently gloomy about the prospect of Africa because all of our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all the testing says not really. Although his hope is that everyone is equal, quote, people who have to deal with black employees find this is not true.
Black IQ is lower. Yeah, it's probably a fact, okay?
Opinions like Watson's have never been based in science, but they're even more discredited in light of evidence confirming that there are no biologically distinct groups that we call races to compare in the first place.
There is no genetic definition of white, or black, or Asian, or Latino. You can't actually identify a gene, a sequence of DNA, or any component that is ubiquitous in any of those populations. There's a very, very deep ingrained tradition of thinking that there are distinct categories of humans, and those categories have a biological basis. But it's actually wrong. There are tens of thousands of populations. Biological variation is enormous in humans, but it does not group into races. So, if you recognize that there is no biological basis for race, that race is a real social, political, and historical reality, but it's not underpinned by biology, then you're stuck with a moral dilemma. Inequality based on something that is not biology is out there. So either you do something about it, or you feign ignorance and don't.
Race, poverty, IQ, and genetics are coming together in a surprising arena: the national crisis of lead poisoning. Parents are suing the lead industry for the devastating impacts the neurotoxin has had on their children. The stakes are high. To avoid a precedent that would make them liable for billions in damages and cleanup costs, the industry is blaming young victims, claiming they have bad genes.
My law firm has been involved in representing children with lead poisoning for a few decades now. And never once through this day has this industry ever taken any steps at all to get lead paint out of the dwellings where our children are living today, where our children continue to get poisoned, and where they recognized back in 1957 that children were dying and becoming permanently brain damaged.
Stephen was born here in Milwaukee in June of 1990. And between age 1 and age 3, he ingested lead paint in his home, which caused him to be poisoned. He was poisoned so severely he had to be hospitalized.
Even after medical treatment, Stephen suffered permanent brain damage. His mother, Carol, decided to take legal action against those responsible.
She fought for this case. She wanted the lead pigment industry to account for what they did to her child, not only because of her love for her own child, but she really was concerned about all the other children who've been poisoned by these manufacturers.
The industry staked out a defense where they blamed the victim. They blamed Stephen, they blamed his mother, they blamed his family. And one of their favorite defenses in this suit was to say, this is genetics.
Dr. Evan, would you agree you're not a neurologist?
No, I'm not a neurologist.
You're not a physician?
I'm not a physician.
You're not a geneticist?
I'm not a geneticist.
There was a neuropsychologist out of Boston whose name is Nancy Hebben, and she's made her living testifying on behalf of the lead industry and on behalf of landlords who are defending lead poisoning cases. She would take full siblings, half siblings, cousins 3 times removed, anybody that they could find that came within any kind of genetic relationship to Stephen at all, and it would scour their report cards. She would ignore every A and every B and every C on that report card.
This is Pauline, and we see that when she was in 9th grade, she had a grade point average of 0.0, which is a pretty low F.
Hebben failed to mention that Stephen's sister Pauline wasn't able to attend school regularly that year. Hebben simply used any low grades and IQ test scores she could find to lead the jury to believe that the Thomas family was genetically unintelligent.
Jennifer, this is Stephen.
That was horrible. I already had a good idea that these people were not my friend, but when I got in there, some of the things they were saying was just like so untrue. They put report cards I didn't even remember I had. Report cards I like forgot all about because I picked myself back up and overcame all of that. What did my report card have to do with the things you did to my little brother?
And she eventually concluded that it didn't really matter even if lead had affected Stephen because he wasn't going to be anything anyhow.
The lead pigment industry dragged out the Thomas trial for more than 8 years. Carol Thomas was deposed 6 times.
He's never been exposed to a single product made by my people at Sherwin-Williams. Has never.
I can't see. Hour after hour after hour of questions designed to humiliate the family, designed to intimidate the family, only because these lawyers want to lay the predicates for their genetic defense.
Carol Thomas never knew the outcome of her son's case. She died of lung cancer before the trial ended.
Unfortunately, at the end of the day, this phony genetic excuse that was invented by the defendants resonated with the jury. And the jury really seemed to be persuaded by a lot of the argument that we think was completely inappropriate and completely impermissible.
We need to expose the fact that this is junk science. There is no foundation for this kind of an argument. And someday, hopefully, science will make that clear. These are shameful acts of defense to avoid responsibility.
The water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and other cities reveals how widespread a problem lead remains throughout the country, especially in low-income neighborhoods. Every day, millions of children are being exposed, even though the Centers for Disease Control say there is no safe level of exposure to this dangerous neurotoxin. Meanwhile, the lead pigment industry continues to use the gene defense as hundreds of these cases make their way through the courts.
And this is America. That is not the way that our society should work. This is not the way science should work. It allows people to just write off these children and say, these kids don't count, they shouldn't get education, they shouldn't get opportunities, they shouldn't be allowed to move ahead simply because of who they are and where they come from.
Can you imagine having an ideology or a worldview where you knew as soon as somebody was born what they were going to be and what they were going to be good for and whether they should be invested in or whether they should be given an opportunity? Nobody in the last century who thought that way is lifted up. Dr. King was not a social Darwinist. Dr. King believed in a beloved community in which people helped each other.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called on America to live up to its promise of equality, and many social advocates are still fighting those battles. Equality of condition in fair and safe housing, equality of justice under the law, and equal education, and most importantly, that every individual is equally valued. But many genetic determinists say the solution to inequality doesn't lie in public policy. In their view, whole segments of our population are simply genetically inferior. So the key to creating a more equal society must lie in eugenics, the attempt to improve the population through genetic engineering and controlled reproduction.
This is the biomolecular revolution. It promises the almost godlike ability to manipulate life at the most fundamental level. It will enable us to change our genetic heritage, enhance our abilities, even shape the evolution of mankind.
A lot of scientists carry with them this myth of the gene, almost to its furthest extent. That there is a thing called the gene, and once we understand that, we're going to be able to manipulate it and modify it to explain why people are unequal and to make some people better.
So according to this worldview, that's where you have to go. Because if you want to change society, you've got to change the genes. That's where their worldview inevitably leads them.
The lower 10% who really have difficulty, even in elementary school. What's the cause of it? A lot of people would like to say, well, it was, poverty and things like that, but it probably isn't. And so I'd like to get rid of, help that lower 10%.
Suppose we have a gene therapy which will raise IQs by 15 points. I think parents, it's okay if they have the right to introduce those kinds of changes in their own children.
Molecular genetics has been an area full of promises. We were told that this is going to allow us to design babies any way we want them, to decide whether we want smart kids, tall kids, short kids, what have you. We now know that it's built on false promises because the theory that gave rise to it is wrong.
Scientists have actually shown that genetic excuses for inequality are unscientific. But the story hasn't been told very often. It puts the very notion of a gene into question and reveals that the concept itself may never have been more than a figment of our collective imagination.
The gene was never discovered. It was not a discovery that somebody did, look down a microscope and said, ha, behold the gene. Instead of that, the gene was a concept. And so we can see throughout the 20th century how different discoveries in science were fitted into the box, the pre-made conceptual box of the gene.
The Austrian monk Gregor Mendel never knew that his garden experiments would eventually be used to explain human heredity and behavior. His work on sweet peas convinced him that plants carried discrete biological elements from one generation to the next in a mathematical, predictable way, and that traits such as the color of a flower could not be changed by changing the environment.
So they translated immediately, without really having to test it, the work on the peas that Mendel had done, and they just assumed that the same principle would apply in all other organisms, especially humans. It allows you to separate anything that is biological from anything that is so-called environment, in such a way that you are born with instructions of who you're going to be. And there's nothing you can do to change that.
The word was coined with the expectation that there existed a hereditary unit that would have certain properties. It was to determine the traits of an organism. It was to pilot life's journey, if you will. And the question for the first half of the 20th century was, what kind of an entity would have these properties?
The race was on when very many different labs start chasing their own favorite molecule. And these biologists and physicists and chemists are all scrambling to come up with some physical embodiment of the gene.
And in 1953, with Watson and Crick's identification of the double helix, a candidate appeared.
Could this complicated substance with the long name be Mendel's particle of heredity, the gene itself?
Watson and Crick's team had focused on DNA, and they felt they'd won the race. 4 chemicals made up the DNA molecule, and they believed different sequences of these chemicals determined different traits. To explain how it all worked, Francis Crick created the famous central dogma of genetics. Crick's theory was much like the chain of command in a typical 1950s corporation. DNA was the gene, the CEO, in total control of heredity. DNA gave orders in the form of the genetic code to middle management. RNA transcribed that message and passed it on to the workers, the proteins. Then the proteins translated the unique code of each living thing and constructed them according to the blueprint. Under Crick's dogma, more complex organisms like human beings must have millions of genes, unlike simpler creatures.
We need to remember that when Watson and Crick presented all this theory, they said flat out that it was a hypothesis. There was no evidence for it.
Biologist Barry Commoner immediately dismissed the central dogma.
It offended my sense of the uniqueness of living things, because here was a paper that insisted that something quite dead, a chemical, was the source of the uniqueness of life.
That notion of a magical double helix maps so perfectly onto this idea that at our core, there's a biological unit, a thing right there, that I pass to my children, that you pass to your children, that thing is identifiable and knowable as a single entity, and that entity is DNA. It's not the case, but it's a powerful metaphor and a really good story.
Will radically change the way we think about ourselves as persons and also eventually as people in society. And I think this is the scientific revolution that is coming.
The mythology of the gene allowed DNA to be imbued with more and more power. Some scientists believed it was the mechanism they'd been looking for to explain Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Random mutations in DNA sequences could be the source of changes in traits that made some organisms better able to adapt, survive, and pass those traits on to the next generation. By the 1980s, the gene myth reached its pinnacle when Richard Dawkins introduced the concept of the selfish gene. This popular theory puts genes in charge of us, body and mind, using us as temporary vehicles in their selfish pursuit to survive.
I was wanting to conjure up in the mind of the reader the image of the organism, including ourselves, as a machine for passing on genes. I wanted to shift the focus away from the idea of the organism as being the agent in life to the immortal replicator, which is the gene, because that was the logic of natural selection. That is the logic of natural selection.
But the notion that DNA held the secret of heredity was seriously challenged when scientists found that only 2% of DNA sequences were associated with creating proteins. The majority of DNA appeared to have no purpose at all. So they referred to the remaining 98% as junk DNA. How could only 2% of a molecule hold the blueprint for life? The discovery came at an inconvenient time.
University and government labs had gone molecular, spending millions on DNA research. Rapid developments in sequencing technology laid the ground for the supreme gene dream, to construct a map of the entirety of human DNA, junk and all, the Human Genome Project.
Locating the 100,000 genes that are blueprints for humanity.
The Genome Project, in this effort to identify the 100,000 genes that make us what we are.
Dr. Francis Collins directed the project, coordinating thousands of university and government labs that participated.
This, in fact, eclipses splitting the atom or going to the moon. This is an adventure into ourselves. We're embarked on this effort to read our own blueprint.
The purpose of the project was to find out all about human genetic structure. And as a consequence, we'd know all about health. But within a very short time, it became clear that crime and alcoholism and intelligence were on the agenda.
How far are we from discovering the genetic causes of human nature?
Very close. What it's going to do is to blow apart a lot of the egalitarian dogma that we have now. That whole way of looking at the world has to change.
Hype about the Genome Project also excited private investors. Scientist J. Craig Venter attracted billions in venture capital when he began his own effort to map the human genome and became the government's heated competitor. A race was on to stake claims on virtually any stretch of DNA, with the promise of profitable patents on genes.
Think of the possibilities. Think of the profits. A lot of people are. The 300 companies already in the billion-dollar biotechnology business.
The Human Genome Project reaches this incredible climax on the cusp of the millennium. And that, of course, is metaphorically incredibly significant, because this idea that this whole vast new area of knowledge, as it were, becomes available just at this historic moment as one moves from one millennium to the next.
Today's main story is a story for the ages that will affect the lives of every human being.
Without a doubt, this is the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind.
And so we have this great publicity, this big press conference, and there was this great, enormous sense of optimism.
It is humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God.
Scientists began delving into their data, searching for genes.
And there's big scientific news today. If your DNA is the book of who you are, it turns out to be closer to a short story. New studies suggest that some past assumptions about our genetic makeup were off base.
As soon as they crack the human genome, immediately it's obvious that there are some very anomalous things about it.
One of the people who was instrumental in working out the genome is quoted as having said that we don't know shit about how the genome works.
Our understanding of the human genome has changed in the most fundamental ways. The small number of genes supports the notion that we're not hardwired.
Dr. Collins, were you surprised at the relatively small number of human genes that we carry?
I certainly was. I was one of those that expected the count to be around 100,000. And what do you know? We turn out to have, slightly less than twice as many genes as a roundworm or a fruit fly. But, well, I guess we're still complicated, and that complication must come from other features.
Francis Collins didn't elaborate on what he meant by other features. He was faced with the shocking evidence that human beings had fewer than 20,000 of these important DNA sequences called genes. Not too different than the humble housefly.
and less than a tomato, which had over 30,000. Pinot Noir grapes and rabbits had twice as many, and wheat had 5 times as many.
So this was sort of like, Houston, we have a problem. Because if these sequences of DNA that they were calling genes were really the Mendelian-like determinants of all of our traits and all of our complexity, we would of course have to have a lot more of them than much simpler creatures.
Not only do simpler creatures often have more of these important DNA sequences, the sequences themselves are basically the same. 50% the same as bananas, 70% the same as a sea urchin, and we share virtually all of our sequences with mice.
I mean, mice are very nice, but they certainly don't write novels or compose symphonies. So it couldn't be that small difference in DNA that creates the enormous differences in physiology, in behavior, and development between a human being and a banana, or a human being and a sea urchin, or a human being and a mouse. So at that moment, you know, we really see this 50-year sort of delusion shattered.
And if DNA can't account for the differences between organisms, how can it be the mechanism of Darwin's evolutionary theory?
Up until very recently, you know, there is an evolutionary story about natural selection acting on random mutation of genes. Which genes? Where are they? Tell us. You know, I'll be very interested to know. You know, so they're really in trouble.
In the years since the conclusion of the Genome Project, scientists have been reeling from the downfall of their long-held gene myth. Behind the scenes, it's clear they can't even agree on what a gene is.
What's a gene these days? I think a gene is like art, right? You know, it's up to your interpretation.
You'll ask 10 different people and they'll describe it differently.
There's going to be debate about what a gene is, probably forever.
When people talk about this problem of defining a gene, there's some hand-wringing that goes on about, oh my gosh, the whole science of genetics is in trouble. Not at all. It's only when you try to do the Webster's dictionary thing that you get in trouble.
So in a sense, what was found with the Human Genome Project is the exact reverse of that which was anticipated. It was going to make everything clear. In fact, this was not the Holy Grail. This was not the Bible of who we are, that you only had to read it and understand things. It only highlights how incredibly complex biology is.
Strictly speaking, the DNA doesn't act at all. The DNA is inert. The DNA has to be acted upon. It doesn't replicate itself. It has to be uncurled in order to be able to be expressed. There are a zillion agents around the cell that are operating on this quite passive but stable piece of DNA. What's so exciting about the present moment in biology has been looking at the cell as a system in which there are many actors and many components, and DNA is an absolutely critical one, but it's not the orchestra leader, it's not the whole orchestra, it's one component.
While DNA isn't the master molecule that biologists imagined, it is a critical molecule in the cell that the organism uses in the production of proteins. DNA is also a sort of cellular fingerprint. Certain sequences are unique enough that people who have been wrongly convicted of a crime can be exonerated. And we can often match pieces of our DNA with family members. But DNA doesn't determine our physical traits.
I don't think we'll ever be able to predict who's going to look similar and who isn't. We can have two children of the same parents and they can look vastly different, but they can also look very similar.
And although we continue to hear that heredity plays a major role in determining our personalities, these claims have never been based in molecular biology. They're based on conclusions of psychological studies, primarily of twins. When researchers interview identical twins,
They often find more similarities in behavior and talents than they find in fraternal twins, and they assume that the reason is biological. But psychologist Jay Joseph says this assumption is at the heart of the problem with twin studies.
Twin studies have been used frequently to argue the point of genetic determinism. There's a theoretical assumption underlying the twin method, which is that the environments of identical and fraternal twins are the same, that identical twins are not more similar because their environment is more similar. But this assumption is false. They look alike, they're treated more alike, they're socialized to be more similar. They have a much stronger emotional bond and connection with each other than fraternal twins. They're much more likely to see themselves as two halves of the same whole. So it's very natural that they would be more alike in their behavior and abilities than fraternal twins for reasons having nothing to do with genetics.
For those who claim that it's worthwhile to continue to search for a biological basis to our personalities and abilities, the burden of proof remains in their hands. Not only do they face the dynamic, complex nature of our biology, but also the infinitely dynamic reality of how each of us develops individually as human beings, how we interact with our families and others to create a society, and how our society feeds back and influences us throughout our lives.
And this kind of interaction and this kind of complexity plays itself out before we are born and goes right on after we are born. I mean, where we live, how active we are, what our opportunities are as children, as grown-ups, our education, our parents' marriage. I mean, all of this is involved in shaping who we are in complicated, interactive, and unpredictable ways. And people change over time. I think we have to face the fact that we are complicated, as are all organisms, and that you can't predict behavior on the basis of biology or on the basis of simple, single environmental reasons.
That is huge, huge implications in terms of political economics. It suggests that if you get the childhood history right, if you get the society right, people will thrive. For a long time, people like Charles Murray propounded this view of why society is like it is, and the Human Genome Project has proved that they are wrong.
So we now know that the gene is not a biological reality, but rather an abstract concept scientists mistakenly placed on DNA. The long-held belief that there's a discrete unit of heredity can no longer hold. Heredity is still a mystery, a complex, unpredictable process not controlled by DNA.
Getting ready to hit the bars.
Though it may be a while before textbooks and the media catch up.
Researchers at a genetic testing firm say that one gene can predict your child's athletic ability.
We've established that this is not about science. This is about PR. This is about buzzwords. This is about keeping a paradigm going that doesn't seem to want to go away.
We still see scientists convincing public and private investors to spend tens of billions of dollars not only looking for genes for intelligence or alcoholism, but saying then we can develop drugs or gene therapies that will cure those problems or perhaps increase intelligence, and whoever does that is going to be making billions.
It's been called the scientific breakthrough of the year. It's all about a way of editing genes known as CRISPR.
If we say that there is a gene that can make somebody brighter or a gene for criminality, that gives the illusion that you could deal with it by identifying that gene and either predicting it in embryos or fetuses and not let them be born, or maybe find treatments with so-called gene therapy.
they predict that about 1% of the population has these violence or bad behavior genes, which is fascinating. The real goal, according to the doctors that we spoke with about this, is to eventually develop treatments to counteract those genes and get rid of violence. Really interesting stuff.
Now, we know because of the science that's just not going to work. But what concerns me is even the attempt to do so would mean genetically engineering, human biology in a state of ignorance, not knowing really what you're changing. So they won't be successful in making a more intelligent child, but they could do a lot of damage on the way.
I sense the tide has changed. Genetic manipulation will be more and more accepted. There are people who say, well, we're playing God. And, I have a straightforward answer. If we don't play God, who will?
The demise of the gene clearly isn't enough to deter Watson and others from fantasies of playing God. The question is, will they ignore the tragic lessons of the past century, when pseudoscience claimed the minds of many Americans, and state governments stripped generations of their most fundamental rights, contributing to the greatest crime of the 20th century?
Okay, this is Lauren's first plane ride right here. We was raised in a very rural area of North Carolina where there was hardly jobs or any work, and the only form of work that was there was farming. We used to go and pick cotton or potatoes or beans or something like that. Instead of us being in school, sometimes we had to be in the field. I remember, my hair was unkempt. I used to wear the same thing over and over and over to school at least 3 times a week. I was really an unkempt little girl.
Like many people growing up in North Carolina in the 50s and 60s, Elaine Riddick Jesse never had the real opportunity she'd been guaranteed as an American citizen. Her fate was bound up with a state built on a system of segregation and Jim Crow laws. The Windfall community suffered in extreme poverty. Elaine watched her parents' marriage fall apart, eventually leading social workers to send her to live with her grandmother. Then, Elaine's life took another tragic turn.
I was a victim of rape. I was molested when I was 13 years old. And the guy that raped me told me if I told anybody that he was going to kill me. So I had to keep it to myself.
Eventually, the social worker noticed that Elaine was pregnant, assumed that she was promiscuous, and recommended that Elaine be examined by the state eugenics board.
The eugenics board was a board of 5 men that sat around a table, and of course they were white men too. They sat around a table and they just marked the paper. Anybody that the social worker would deem feeble-minded or slow or having a problem, this social worker would come in and say, I want this person sterilized. And boom, they stamped it and that was that.
The board was presented with an evaluation from the social worker, who insisted that there was no hope for Elaine, that she got along poorly with other children, and that an IQ test showed that she was feeble-minded.
No one asked me, what's wrong? Can I help you? Are you hungry? Are you cold? Maybe I'm sick. No one took the time to find out what was the problem.
Elaine discovered the board had completely ignored another evaluation they received by a psychologist who said her chief problem was her environment. She was doing above-average work in school, and any difficulties she had getting along with others was likely due to the fact that she was always being bullied by other students and was generally hungry. The board favored the social worker's recommendation.
I had my son and I woke up in bandages, not knowing what it was for. They went inside of me and sterilized me without my knowledge, because I was black, poor, and my mother was in a prison. My dad was running around. He was an alcoholic. My mother was an alcoholic. So they automatically assumed that I was going to become an alcoholic. And then, without even my son as a baby, automatically assuming that he was the third generation and that he was going to be an alcoholic also. What they wanted to do was nip it in the bud right then. Stop this family tree. They want to cut the tree down. And I want to know who in the world give these people the right to go and do these sort of things to another human being. You know, even in Germany, Hitler didn't have the right to do this. We're the ones that educated Hitler on this stuff here, sterilization.
My interest in eugenics certainly comes in part from the experience of myself being a refugee from Hitler and being keenly aware of what was done in the name of science, and specifically in the name of genetics. But that happened in this country as well, of course, in a certain sense. The Nazis imported it from the United States, which had a flourishing eugenics movement.
At the turn of the 20th century, eugenics was widely accepted in the United States as solid science among the country's top psychologists, scientists, politicians, and social thinkers. During this first Gilded Age, it was the creation of the gene concept itself that ignited what became a powerful eugenics movement.
So one reason that the eugenics movement was so influential at the time was because it provided a scientific solution, or a supposedly scientific solution, to a political problem.
The Gilded Age was the first time in American history in which you had people sitting on top of the entire economy, vast fortunes made on the backs of average people. At the same time, a new wave of immigrants coming into this country with nothing. And our cities became fetid slums in contrast to the extraordinary wealth that the robber barons, as we called them, were enjoying. We were in danger of losing our economy and our democracy.
People forget, in 1900, there was no middle class in America. In 1900, there was no weekend in America. There's not one single paid holiday. We had this extreme laissez-faire, social Darwinist reality, and the vast majority of Americans were fighting to change it.
People took to the streets, held massive general strikes, demanded better living and working conditions, and an end to laissez-faire, unregulated capitalism.
If that's the explanation, then the true way to fix that is to pay higher wages and to give people a better environment in which to live. And it was clear which explanation would be preferable to the captains of capitalist industry in the early 20th century, and that is the biological explanation.
The wealthiest families in the country provided millions in research funding to scientists in an attempt to prove that social problems were primarily a result of defective genetics. At the prestigious Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, Harry Laughlin, an animal breeder, directed the Eugenics Record Office. He claimed they could predict who would inherit good or bad traits by using a mathematical formula from Mendel. They were also firm believers in Charles Darwin, who clearly applied his theory of natural selection to human society. Eugenicists saw themselves as agents of evolution, doing their duty to ensure that the fittest Americans survived.
They said, we have to find a way to have people who are more evolved make more babies. We have to find a way to have people who are poor and who have all these diseases and all this bad genetic structure produce less.
Laughlin organized exhibits in communities across the country to educate the public about eugenics. Families underwent detailed physical and mental examinations as they competed to win the prize for the best heredity. But eugenicists disagreed on what should be done with people they considered unfit. Some argued that laissez-faire economic policies might be severe enough to eliminate so-called defectives from the gene pool.
Society should not coddle in any way the poor. Don't help them. Don't help them through charity. Don't help them through legislation. You see, if you help them, according to the social Darwinists, you would only enable them to reproduce more of them. Society would be better off if we instituted survival of the fittest. We would get stronger, just as species become stronger when their weakest members die off and their strongest members live on to reproduce.
But it would take decades before this social Darwinian approach would be effective. So many eugenicists considered a quicker solution, one that would eventually be used by the Nazis: euthanasia. Some called for outright execution of the unfit, as well as lethal neglect of newborns they considered defective. But in the end, they agreed that euthanasia would be used at too dear a moral price. Sterilization was the favored alternative. Biologist Harry Laughlin wrote the model law that North Carolina eventually used to sterilize Elaine Riddick. He called for millions of people he considered defective to be forcibly sterilized, as well as relatives who might be carrying supposed recessive genes for inferior traits. In 1927, the Supreme Court upheld Harry Laughlin's model law and ruled 8-1 that the Constitution permitted U.S. citizens to be forcibly sterilized. Congress never passed a federal sterilization law, but it's estimated that by the end of World War II, under state laws, at least 80,000 Americans had been forced to undergo hysterectomies, tubal ligation, vasectomies, and castration.
It was only in 1933, after the Nazis took over, that Germany had any eugenic laws at all. The first law they passed was for the heredity of future generations, and that was their sterilization law. And they modeled it on Laughlin's model law. In fact, they were so grateful to Laughlin for his leadership in this area that they gave him an honorary medical degree from Heidelberg in 1936 for research on purifying the germplasm of the human population.
Laughlin was an enthusiastic supporter of the Third Reich. The Eugenical News, which Laughlin edited, just fawned over Germany and its progressive policies. And in fact, there was a certain envy. Germany is getting too far ahead of us in applying the conclusions of science to the structure of society. The most significant similarity was the emphasis on racial purity.
Strict control of immigration was crucial to eugenic goals. In the 1920s, Congress debated whether to impose racial quotas and hired Harry Laughlin as a special agent to investigate the subject and offer his recommendations. Laughlin particularly wanted to shut out Eastern and Southern Europeans.
Immigrants were being castigated as low-level people, as the dregs of humanity. Words like this were used in publications as prestigious as the Saturday Evening Post, and the call was very strong politically and economically to restrict immigration. What Harry Laughlin provided was charts of data that he took to the Congressional Committee, purporting to show that People from Italy, from Poland, from the Slavic countries were genetically inferior to the Northern European, to the Nordic, the Aryan, the Anglo-Saxon. And that this genetic inferiority was going to have a major impact on future generations in the United States.
Laughlin presented data from supposedly objective IQ tests that immigrants were forced to take at Ellis Island upon their arrival. Laughlin neglected to mention that many of them were reeling from the crowded 2-week journey they just made across the Atlantic. Trips that were often marked by sickness, sleeplessness, and hunger. If they didn't do well on math problems or abstract image or writing tests, immigrants were marked with an X, declared feeble-minded, and deported.
And they used eugenics arguments that people who were coming in had these bad genes. But Congress passed overwhelming legislation to limit the capacity of these groups to come in.
Even when it was clear that Jewish people were being persecuted by the Nazis, they were a central target of the racial quotas and were denied entry into the United States. In some estimates, up to 2 million Jewish immigrants who died in the Holocaust might have escaped their fate if Congress hadn't passed the racist law. In 1939, nearly 1,000 refugees escaped and sailed all the way to Cuba, hoping to eventually enter the United States. They were stranded in the waters off Havana as they awaited news of their fate. Families rowed out to the ship, hoping to get a glimpse of their loved ones. But the Cuban government turned them away, and the White House was silent. The refugees were forced to return to Europe as the Nazis expanded their occupation. The same year, a bill was introduced that would have allowed 20,000 children, most of them Jewish, to come to the United States. Foster families were ready to take them in. But Laughlin and other members of an anti-Semitic coalition lobbied against relaxing the racial quotas for any reason. The bill was defeated, leaving the children no escape from the hands of the Nazis. The widespread rejection of Jewish refugees convinced the Nazis that other nations shared their views of Jewish racial inferiority.
Since being Jewish was considered to be an inherited thing, you couldn't convert away from it. The only thing to do to rid the body politic of that burden was kill people. And that makes that worst crime of history a piece of bad science, among other things. When Hitler was elected in 1933 in a free election, one of his slogans was, "All politics is applied biology." Okay? And that's the red light that one has to see on the road and not go down that road, ever.
By the end of World War II, sterilization continued, but rates diminished in most states. Organizations and journals changed the word eugenics in their names to genetics to avoid association with the unpopular movement. But many prominent scientists, encouraged by the discovery of DNA, continued to believe in the gene and to advocate for eugenics, including the two co-discoverers themselves. In a speech to his fellow scientists, Francis Crick offered his own eugenic vision.
We have to ask, do people have a right to have children? Or to have at least as many children as they please? And it seems to me that we have to begin to consider that the answer to this question might be no, they don't have a right. But the child is handicapped. Wouldn't it be better to let that child die and have another one? And what about a child that's born incurably blind? Is there any reason nowadays for keeping such a child alive? In other words, should we not have an acceptance test for children?
James Watson also regrets that eugenics has been tainted by the Nazi legacy. He says it's our responsibility to prevent the birth of those he deems unfit, as long as families themselves make the decisions. Watson believes in the unlimited use of genetic engineering to enhance future generations, and isn't worried such eugenic measures would be taken to the extreme.
Hitler's got us twice. We're hostage to what Hitler did, and that things which we might say are sensible, we can't do because people say, well, Hitler would have done exactly the same thing.
The DNA discovery helped to obscure the country's eugenic past. But the battle continued between those who claimed that inequality is natural and inevitable, and those who fought to expand equal rights to everyone who'd been left out.
So will you join in the battle to give every citizen the full equality which God enjoins and the law requires, whatever his belief or race or the color of his skin?
Lyndon Johnson's Great Society represented a total rejection of the eugenic worldview. It was the most ambitious effort in the government's history to deliver on the American promise. Among the hundreds of pieces of the Johnson administration's legislation was the Immigration Reform Act, which abolished racial quotas encouraged by Harry Laughlin in the 1920s. Other laws banned discrimination against people with disabilities, who had also been targets of eugenics.
So there is a kind of dominant theme that's going to take over American political intellectual life, that people can and should mobilize to change their condition.
We will walk until we are free, until we can walk to any school and take our children to any school in the United States.
Social movements mobilized under the banner of equality and created the pressure Johnson needed to push through bills that addressed racial discrimination.
Not only did the Great Society defeat centuries-long belief in biological genetic determinism of poverty and inequality, it said that those could be conquered through social programs, and then it did that.
Johnson was a New Deal Democrat. He intended to use his presidency to go further than Franklin Roosevelt and to reach millions who still languished in poverty. He reminded Americans that genetics was not the root of the problem.
Poverty is not a trait of character. It is created anew in each generation, but not by heredity, by circumstances. Today, millions of American families are caught in circumstances beyond their control.
People are interested in being treated as human beings. They're interested in having other people treat them, as the Declaration of Independence says, as equals. That's the first thing that's needed in the war against poverty.
There was no better person to represent the view that biology was not destiny than Sergeant Shriver. As director of OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, he knew he could pass concrete legislation that would tackle poverty head-on. With Johnson's help, Shriver convinced Congress to approve $700 million to launch a remarkable set of programs.
This is Dick Van Dyke, here to tell you about an army America is using in its all-out war against poverty.
Thousands of Americans seeking equality of opportunity enlisted in programs such as Volunteers in Service to America, Job Corps, Upward Bound, Teacher Corps, and Youth Corps. Shriver also created the Legal Services Program to provide lawyers to people who couldn't afford representation. Thousands of communities were now able to sue cities for discrimination, to fight evictions, and to hold landlords accountable for housing violations. In an effort to advance equality of condition, communities in remote areas were given access to health care for the first time, as well as grants for adult literacy programs and to improve infrastructure.
I think people have the wrong ideas about the poverty program, that it's sort of a handout. That, you're going around giving money to people, and it's, as soon as the money's spent, it's not going to do any good. What I've seen today indicates that what you're doing is training people, and you're giving people an opportunity to do for themselves, and it takes the action of government.
One of Shriver's most successful programs was Head Start, which provided early education, nutrition, and medical services to compensate for the lack of opportunities that held poor children back. Head Start programs allowed millions of children to thrive. The success of these programs disrupted power relations across the country, prompting city and state officials to pressure Shriver to cut off funding. Shriver didn't back down.
For the first time in the history of this country, poor people actually have a place and a way in which to express themselves. We're creating life at the community level. When you got life, you got movement, you got dissension, you got action. That's what we want.
By 1970, War on Poverty and other Great Society programs led to the fastest and sharpest decrease in poverty in the country's history, over 40%.
And that goes completely against genetic theory. No one was changing genes at this time. This was done through social programs. And that's when we begin to see this very strong counter-revolution begin to take shape.
By 1969, new leadership at the White House radically shifted the direction of the country away from Johnson's egalitarian vision of a great society. Secret tapes recorded in the Oval Office revealed Nixon's racist view that certain groups of people were less evolved than others. Pseudoscientific papers came out at the time that bolstered Nixon's prejudices and revived eugenic claims about IQ.
And it was the center of the counter-attack, the resistance to widening equality and widening equality of opportunity.
15% of the blacks are above the average white. 85% are below.
And the argument was programs like Head Start were essentially not workable because the difference between inner city black kids' IQs and white Caucasian IQs was genetic, and that because of genetic determinism, there's nothing you can do in the environment and the educational process that will really make up for that difference.
Like eugenicists before him, Jensen believed black people should limit their birth rate in order to phase out bad intelligence genes. And he felt the policies allowing them to receive welfare benefits only exacerbated the problem. Nixon was also disturbed by continuing the current policies.
First, we cannot delay longer in accomplishing a total reform of our welfare system.
We're going to put more of these little legal bastards on welfare rolls at $2,400 a family. I have great sympathy for it, but I know they ain't going to make it for 500 years. They aren't.
As Daniel Moynihan put it, at the time that the Nixon budget was being planned, the winds of Jensenism were gusting through the White House with gale force. How convenient for the Nixon budget that just at the time that he wanted to cut back on programs, it could cite the scientists' findings as a rational justification for what is truly based on different motives.
We did want to dismantle OEO, but we knew that the Congress wouldn't do it. So instead of just declaring one day that OEO was out of business, we resorted to all kinds of trick and artifice to try and strangle it.
I have no intention of sitting idly by and watching my husband's dream turn into a nightmare.
And so the forces appear to be joined. The poor people declaring that they have declared war on the administration's efforts to cut off the war on poverty.
Despite the controversy, the administration was able to move many war on poverty programs out of the Office of Economic Opportunity to other agencies and cut funding by more than 50%. However, Nixon did expand federal support for a war on poverty program he felt very strongly about: birth control for the poor.
The people in what we call our class control their populations. The people who don't control their families are the people that shouldn't have kids.
As part of its birth control effort, the administration quietly distributed a memo to federal clinics across the country, informing them that for the first time, war on poverty funds could be used to cover the costs of sterilizations.
It was a program that became abused because the people at the top who were distributing the money never bothered to issue the rules and regulations that would have made sure that adult women and men who were interested in family planning and interested in contraception could get what they wanted. And instead, it became a program that for many people resulted in forced sterilizations.
Joseph Levin filed a lawsuit against the Nixon administration after he discovered that two young girls, Minnie Relf, age 14, and Mary Alice Relf, age 12, were sterilized at a clinic in Montgomery, Alabama.
At no time prior to the surgery did any physician discuss with the girls or their parents the nature or consequences of the surgery to which Minnie and Mary Alice were about to be subjected. The girl's
mother was given a consent form by the doctor. He knew she couldn't read, and clinic workers pressured Minnie to sign a consent form, falsely stating she was 21.
Dr. Warren Hearn, working at the War on Poverty, develops these guidelines. And these guidelines say that no one can be sterilized without informed consent and there can be no coercion. So these guidelines actually would have prevented the sterilization of the Relf sisters.
But his guidelines were never delivered to the clinics. They were being held up at the White House.
I got a call from Dr. Cooper telling me that I must refrain from any contact with the White House or OMB. And I said I was just trying to do my job and find out where the guidelines were. My attempts to find out about them were met with hostility, harassment, attempts at intimidation, and pointed invitations to resign.
Finally, he realized they weren't going to distribute them, and so he quit.
So these guidelines were never distributed to clinics. Even the 200 copies that Dr. Hearn had himself were taken out of his office and put in a safe place. And in the following investigation about what happened to these guidelines, the White House responds to the questions by saying, it suited our purposes. It suited our purposes to suppress these guidelines.
We came to learn that maybe there were as many as 500 of these clinics functioning throughout the United States. And it was sort of up to the nurses and the doctors as to who got what. And they made their judgment about who was worthy and who wasn't.
We are suing HEW for non-enforcement, non-monitoring of the sterilization regulations. We are also seeking consent forms in Spanish and
I'm talking about the deprivation and the genocide of American Indian people. I'm talking about our women, 42% who were sterilized from 1971 to 1975, and not a whimper from this, of indignation from this country.
The U.S. District Court judge who resided over the Relf case found that during the Nixon administration, nearly 400,000 poor people were sterilized without being fully informed. There was evidence, the judge said, that an indefinite number had been coerced into operations under the threat of losing federal assistance. Many others were sterilized without their knowledge.
It almost sounded as if we were talking about some Nazi-era plan. It really was a practice of eugenics because these clinics didn't see anything wrong with controlling the birth rate of people who they viewed as a burden on society. That simple.
The hospital after 3 days.
The Ralph lawsuit resulted in Judge Gerhard Gesell requiring the federal government to issue stringent guidelines on sterilization, and that included a ban on the sterilization of any minor, anyone under 18. So what we have here is a real triumph for the Ralph family. They take this case all the way to federal court in Washington, D.C., and they say, you know what? This happened to our daughters, but we're not going to let it happen to anybody else's daughter ever again. And after this litigation, they win. And this stops the entire second wave of sterilizations in the United States.
After the Ralph case, there were few open calls for sterilization or other extreme eugenic proposals, and the fight for equality continued.
That we were fighting for our dignity. We were empowering the least educated among us, the poorest among us.
500 to 600 people in wheelchairs with walking canes and hearing aids to stop discrimination against the disabled.
At the same time that rights have expanded for some people over the last 40 years, we've also seen increasing inequality for others, as well as the reemergence of eugenic ideas that were prominent in the first Gilded Age.
You have a kind of prevailing belief amongst the ruling elite in social Darwinism. And it's a closet, it's kind of come in through the back door. Very few people are prepared to actually come out with it and say, you know, I think women are born different from men, I think the poor are born inferior. But that actually is what they believe. If you talk to them, they don't really believe in the redemptive power of society to change the conditions of people, to create much more equality.
We've also seen a resurgence of the laissez-faire ideology that dominated the early years of industrial capitalism.
Their view is, harking back to survival of the fittest, the market should determine whether or not people, for example, survive. The government should play no role. And so the last 30 years have been saturated with the idea that the social change we saw in the 60s and the 70s, that was a blip on the screen, unfortunate. What's really important, everybody for themselves.
Ronald Reagan finished the job that Nixon started. As someone who had opposed every major piece of civil rights legislation and Great Society programs, Reagan rolled back major gains made by social movements. And like Nixon, he used language coated with racial and class prejudices that appealed to many white voters.
Reagan has the image of social welfare as being undeserved. There's the undeserving poor. There are people on welfare who are driving Cadillacs, and that's one of the mantras he's using.
This strategy was described by Reagan's aide and campaign political director, Lee Atwater.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. Now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
I raised some of the questions discussed by the scholarly work of Charles Murray in The Public Interest. At the time, this wasn't exactly fashionable, but since then, things have been changing.
The Reagan administration found a convenient justification for cutting social programs in social scientist Charles Murray's early writings.
You called for scrapping the entire federal welfare and income support structure, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment, workers' compensation, subsidized housing, the whole thing.
The whole thing.
And such a step would leave working-age person with no recourse whatsoever except the job market, family members, friends, and public and private locally funded services.
The implication was, why should we provide welfare and other public benefits to these people? We don't want them to take over our society. The society, in order to be fit, needs to have, in fact, again, not stated explicitly, but this was the implicit message, fewer of them.
We see lowering taxes on the rich. We see a shredding of the safety net. We see an attack on unions. We see a million kids taken off school lunches. We see 1 million elderly people and disabled knocked off Medicaid. We see 500,000 people taken off welfare. So this was an enormous change in American policy from the Great Society.
Well, let me say, I read Charles Murray's latest article on this, and I think he did the country a great service. I mean, he and I often have disagreed, but I think his analysis is essentially right. Now, whether his prescription is right, I question. Let me say why. There is no question that we need to that if we reduced aid to families with dependent children, it would be some incentive for people not to have dependent children out of wedlock. I think we ought to ask ourselves whether it is right. Is it morally right? If it is right, we ought to do it.
Ultimately, Bill Clinton worked with Congress to propose legislation with draconian cuts to social programs. Many Democrats spoke out against the bill.
America is not about bashing children because they're born out of wedlock. It is not about bashing women as illicit and unfit mothers.
Just how many millions of infants will be put to the sword is not yet clear. Those involved will take this disgrace to their graves.
The final welfare reform law that Congress approved not only ended federal aid to families with dependent children, it also deprived hundreds of thousands of documented immigrants access to basic government aid like disability, and slashed child nutrition programs. Analysts predicted the bill would push more than 1 million children into poverty. President Clinton signed it anyway. 20 years later, studies show the welfare legislation actually led to more than 3 million children living on less than $2 a day.
There is no more food at this time. You can come back next Monday at 2 o'clock. That's it, Mommy, that's it. No, sir, I'm sorry, no more.
Please raise your hand if you're here to see the dentist.
A lot of other good doctors here, cancer doctors, bone doctors, heart doctors.
We have children and diabetics and stuff out here that can't sit here till 3 in the morning.
Right.
The reason why so many people are in need is not because they are inherently unable to make something of themselves. It's because we've had a catastrophic economic situation that began when Wall Street blew up, nearly taking the rest of the economy with it. Americans have struggled, and many of those Americans desperately need the safety nets in order to survive.
And if you tell the truth about it, it's a complex set of problems. You need a complex set of solutions that will include, inevitably, government. If you don't like government, you can't even tell the truth about the problem. You make up the reason. The reason is you just got some people are just born dumb. Well, that's a good, simple reason, and then you got a good, simple solution. Don't do anything, but you get a terrible outcome. And that's the great danger of this social Darwinist fantasy taking over bigger and bigger parts of the American imagination.
Continuing cuts in critical social services are resulting in millions of premature deaths, especially for people of color. Poor children in this country are now twice as likely to die in their first year of life than if they were born wealthy, often because they're malnourished and their parents can't afford the critical health care they need during that first year. People are dying from poverty and inequality at similar rates as other leading causes of death, demonstrating that the United States has been implementing on a large scale what would otherwise be considered a eugenic program. And there are troubling signs that other cruel eugenic policies of the past are re-emerging.
We face a choice that will echo through history. In 1924, a racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic Congress passed legislation slamming the door shut on Jewish and Italian and Greek and Eastern European immigrants. We must not do so again. To stop thousands of desperate people who are fleeing unspeakable violence is unconscionable. We might as well take down the Statue of Liberty.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists,
You cannot rebuild your civilization with somebody else's babies.
We've essentially phased out the promotion of assimilation, and we promoted instead multiculturalism and diversity as if it were our strength.
We have to be willing to say to all those who are non-European, we wish you well, but this territory is for us.
So you want me to leave?
Under certain circumstances, yes, we would ask you to go. Unless whites are prepared to exclude people, then they will be shoved aside. That is the fate which I will fight until my last breath.
It's when people get a chance to see the actual outcome of these ideas, they are repulsed. Not just Americans, people all around the world. It is not who humans are. It's not who we are. We're not a sink or swim country. We're a better country than that.
There is a growing awareness about what has been done in the name of the gene.
My name is Willis C. Lynch. I'm from Littleton, North Carolina, 77 years old. And I was operated on in 1948 when I was 14 years old.
My name is Elaine Riddick. I am a victim of eugenics.
Sterilization survivors such as Elaine Riddick Jesse have become strong advocates for justice and have made eugenics a national issue. And some governors have made formal apologies to victims and offered compensation. Significant gains are also being made against the gene defense. Fidelma Fitzpatrick and her legal team won a landmark judgment in California against the lead pigment industry. The money is funding a program to inspect tens of thousands of homes and to remove toxic lead paint. In the future, we'll look back at the gene concept as pseudoscience, in the same way we look back at royal blood, skull size, and other determinist theories that justified oppression and inequality.
Realizing that the concept of the gene is really just an empty word is an incredibly liberating thing. You come to realize that, yes, we are actually very dynamic organisms that are influenced and can influence everything around us.
Add a little bit of water. I can tell by your dress.
It's very freeing to dispose of this genetic determinism. The real question is, do we have the political will at this time in history to make the changes that will allow us to...
That we will continue with the project that we set out on in 1776.
Burma, Estonia, Ethiopia.
It's become really fashionable to be cynical about the American dream in public discourse. But every single American, when they see a child, they believe in their heart that that kid should be able to make it, to work hard and get somewhere. It is the defining quality of being an American, is that you believe that's true. Now, that doesn't mean you believe it is true. It means that you believe it should be true. That dream is a powerful dream. It is the magnet that brought us all here together. And if you throw it away, that thing that helped us come together, if it's gone, we will come apart. We'll come apart as a country. We're either going to turn to each other or on each other in this new century.